So this two-pronged approach of calm and insight, and I think metta practice we can put as part of both calm and insight. It was translated by one Tibetan teacher. Well, I'm not sure if it's his translation or an English translation of what he said, but he described it as calming the mind and discerning the real. I quite like that. Discerning what's true, really, on the basis of our calm mind. So this is, very central distinction in practice, and a lot of approaches to meditation practice really hinge on this two-pronged approach. But that's not the aim, that's not the end point. What's our ultimate aim? I mean, there's lots of ways we could talk about the ultimate aim, but one way I think we could put it, and this is what I mean by a deeper calm, is that we no longer react to things, we no longer create suffering for ourselves and others, not just because we've learned to calm down, but because we have a deep understanding of the conditioned nature of experience, of the three characteristics. So we cultivate calm to develop insight, but then on the basis of that insight, there's a deeper calm from which we can respond appropriately. There was a Zen teacher who once defined awakening as an appropriate response, a response to whatever comes at us in our lives that isn't just based on our contracted sense of self, our reactivity, that's based on something much deeper. So the calming practice we can do when we have a space and some time, and we can focus on the body and the breath and ourselves, but with enough insight in a way that there's a deeper calm that just doesn't get shaken. Maybe this is what is meant by equanimity. So the Buddha said in discourse on the simile of the heartwood, he describes a person going to seek heartwood, like hard bark, the hard wood inside a tree, but instead taking away the bark and the branches and the leaves and mistaking those for heartwood. So that's the simile. So he's getting at what's the heartwood of the spiritual life. And he says, this life is not lived for the sake of possessions, honour and popularity. Well, probably we knew that. But not even for the accomplishment of ethics, even though that's important for practice, or for the accomplishment in, my translation says immersion, but it's like composure or calm, samatha, or for knowledge and vision, insight, clear seeing. Those are not the ultimate aim. So he concludes, rather, the goal, the heartwood, and the final end of the spiritual life is the unshakable freedom of the heart. So anything else we do, calming practices, insight practices, metta, it's all pointing us in this direction. So not so easy to talk about, but one aspect that I'd just like to touch on is that insight into the three qualities of experience based on the foundation of permanence. It includes seeing that the changing nature of our experience is not random. It arises and passes depending on conditions. And particularly this applies to our reactivity or our response to things. It applies to everything in the world, but most crucially for our practice, the rising nature applies to our own response to what happens. And there are many ways this is described in the text. There are many lists of chains of dependent arising phenomena. Some of them you may be familiar with. There's a very well-known list of 12 links, but in fact there are many examples, and they begin and end in slightly different places. Some of them begin with ignorance, some of them begin with consciousness, and some of them they end with different aspects of suffering. Some of them end with sorrow and despair, some of them end with obsessional thinking, a lot of them end with quarrels and disputes. That seemed to be quite important. But they all include a very crucial link between feeling and craving or grasping, or clinging. So the if you wanted to sum up all these different links, what basically is being said is that because we are in the world with a body and a mind and senses, we make contact. We make contact with objects, people, feelings, mental images, all kinds of things come through our senses at us. And every one of them has a feeling tone. So this isn't a complex emotion. This is just the simple fact of what it feels like to have an experience. And that one of the things about that is that everything that comes in through the senses is immediately felt as pleasant or unpleasant or somewhere in between. Couldn't really be any other way, of course. This is just given, really. This just happens. But very quickly, this Martine Batchelor translates feeling tone here as tonality. It begins to shade into a response of liking and not liking, or indifference to what's in the middle, to our experience. So although this is very simple and in some ways maybe feels a bit obvious, it's seen in the tradition in Buddhist psychology as a very crucial moment in our practice and in our lives, because pleasant feeling tone tends to lead to our underlying tendency to wanting, to greed, to clinging, wanting more of what we like. Unpleasant feelings tend to lead to a tendency to aversion, pushing away, defending against. And if it's not quite one or the other, sometimes we barely notice neutral feelings. So the underlying tendency is sometimes said to be confusion. Or we might just, we might be unaware of it, but then it might still pull us in one direction or another. If we pay close attention to neutral feelings, we often start to notice they're very slightly pleasant or very slightly unpleasant. And so it can be worth thinking, am I experiencing this neutral feeling as boring, a little unpleasant, we want more stimulation? Or actually is it a resting state, which isn't directly pleasant, but is free from pain? So is slightly pleasant in that sense. But the most, perhaps more crucial ones, or the ones we're more likely to be driven by, are the stronger feelings of pleasant and unpleasant, liking and disliking, very quickly leading into wanting or not wanting. And if we can cultivate more awareness of this, then these feelings are less likely to pull us into more complex mood states, such as anxiety, ill will, anger, low mood, suffering of various kinds. But what often happens is that feeling gives rise to clinging. We want more of the pleasant, less of the unpleasant, and we're not quite sure what to do if it's somewhere in the middle. So then the different chains describe how we might start obsessively thinking about how to arrange things to satisfy our desires, or we might get into quarrels and disputes to think with people that are in the way of us getting what we want, or we might just suffer in other ways. But we act in different ways to try to arrange things to satisfy what we want. And this is where we can break the chain that leads to suffering. We can not be drawn into clinging or aversion in response to feeling tone. We still have all the feelings, but we can free ourselves from being driven by them. Because it's impossible, even if we wanted to really, but it's impossible to rearrange our lives so that we only have pleasure and avoid pain. But we can practice so that we have the capacity to deal with whatever arises. And this is a really key aspect of practice, of mindfulness practice, of meditation practice, to cultivate this level of equanimity in the face of what arises and passes. And this is what I'm getting at when I talk about a deeper calm. It's based on insight, but it's a deeper calm. So just a couple of other points about feeling tone. One thing worth saying, it's not inherent in the object. We often think it is. We like ice cream and we don't like chili or whatever it is. But other people or ourselves in a different situation might have a very different perception. So the feeling tone arises in the moment, depending on the particular conditionings of that moment. So again, this is part of seeing through the sense of self, you know, rather than I'm the kind of person who always likes ice cream. Well, it's just in this moment, there can be a pleasant feeling in response to ice cream, but that may or may not happen depending on the circumstances. Now, obviously, there are other feeling tones in our lives that are much more important and difficult perhaps and challenging. But even there, like with physical pain, for example, if we move up close and investigate it, sometimes we'll notice there are other sensations there. It's not all painful. I remember someone in a mindfulness course once who had a bad knee for years, and doing a body scan noticed that within the pain there was warmth, and the warmth was actually pleasant. And that was quite a turning point. The other thing we notice is that moment where we move into clinging, where we add a layer of evaluation, reactivity, wanting, not wanting, what the Buddha sometimes called the second arrow. The first arrow is just the experience, perhaps pain, and then there's everything else we add. So I think insight, we could almost define insight as the outcome of insight, perhaps, the freedom that it brings us, is about changing our response to feeling tone. It's really very simple. It's not easy, but it's really very simple. It might be just by shifting our perception of what we like and don't like. And it can also just be the allowing the feeling tone. Vedana is the word in Pali. You'll sometimes hear used, the Vedana, the feeling tone, to just arise and pass. And if we really allow that without that sense of, oh, I like this, I don't like that, I want this, I don't want that, there's a lot more equanimity that can arise. So this is what I mean. This supports a sense of a deeper level of calm. It's a deeper calm than just being still and breathing and, rest and digest. All that's very beautiful and very important and really helpful to be able to cultivate. But in a way, this is a kind of calm that even in the midst of activity, when maybe the body and mind can be quite agitated, we've seen through something. We've seen that there's a layer of suffering that we no longer add to our experience because of practicing with feeling tone, with like and dislike, so that we become much steadier in the face of things. And then we can respond. If a response is needed, we can respond appropriately. Some of you will have come across Mark Williams, who works at Oxford Mindfulness Centre, and he's developed a whole 8-week mindfulness course, not particularly, it's very rooted in Buddhism, but it's being taught in secular context, but really focused on feeling tone, on Vedana. And he talks about sometimes we can notice a feeling tone, maybe a painful or difficult feeling tone, or maybe a pleasant feeling tone, but no action is required. I find that quite a helpful reflection, just sometimes thinking, okay, unpleasant feeling, no action required. Now, sometimes action is required. If the unpleasant feeling is because, you've put your hand in a hot oven, action is required. But often it isn't. But if it is, then we're more likely to act appropriately if we're not just kind of impulsively reacting to pleasure and pain, wanting and not wanting. So that the key to stillness, the key to contentment, the key to calmness is not based just on what's arising, what's happening to us, which is out of our control very often, but much more about how we respond to what happens. And so then real, much deeper freedom of mind becomes possible. Ralph Waldo Emerson said once, "Serenity is not freedom from the storm, but peace within the storm. I think that's rather lovely. It's quite simple, but quite important, because we can never rearrange our lives to have no storms. But just what would it be? And we've probably all had tastes of this in our practice, but what would it be to just have pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and for it not really to matter that much which it is, and to choose our response wisely. If it really didn't bother us so much, that conditioned flux, that part of that impermanence of pleasant, unpleasant, somewhere in between. So although it's quite simple, I think it has quite a profound impact. And I guess I think this teaching, this word Vedana, feeling tone, it comes up in a lot of Buddhist lists. It's the second of the 4 applications of mindfulness. It comes up in, as I said, in all the different chains of dependent arising. At a certain point, they don't always use the same words, but they talk about finding some things pleasant and finding some things not pleasant. That is a key condition in what gives rise to wanting and clinging and aversion and suffering, quarrels, disputes, etc., etc. And so if we can sit in that moment of contact, just the initial feeling tone, if we can just stop there for a moment, that little gap, then we can choose our response rather than being pulled into those chains that cause suffering. So I think although it does appear in quite a lot of lists, I think it's also sometimes an underestimated aspect of practice. Maybe because it seems so simple. Yeah, oh yeah, everything that I feel is either pleasant or unpleasant or somewhere in between. But what would it be like if that felt, how can I put this, of just more accepting of that flow without wanting it to be different? Assuming, as I say, that the unpleasant isn't something really damaging that, we do need to avoid. And it doesn't mean that we don't seek pleasure and enjoy it when we get it, but that we're not driven by that seeking, and we're not so disappointed when things don't work out. And again, that kind of helps us to overcome our self-referential wishes, that sense of I want, I don't want, but just more, this is the flow of life, and how can I respond appropriately?